GMAT all day.
Even if you are like me and you don't necessarily love absolute value questions on the GMAT, something that everybody should know about absolute value are just its basic properties. Because a lot of times the test writers on the GMAT like to use absolute value to really just test your understanding of number properties. Also, don't forget the GMAT is an adaptive test, which means there are easy and medium and hard questions for every subject. So even if you think of absolute value as a hard subject, well, there are easy and medium absolute value questions as well, which anybody should be able to get. And oftentimes you can get those just by knowing these basic properties. One of those basic properties is just the very definition of absolute value. And so if the last time you saw the concept of absolute value was when you were in middle school, you might just remember it as that thing, those two bars where everything inside the bar, you just make positive. So absolute value of 5 is equal to 5. And then it is also true, though, that the absolute value of negative 5 is equal to 5. Now, this is an okay definition when you're trying to teach absolute value to middle schoolers and all you care about is giving them a definition that will allow them to get the answer right on a test. But in the case of the GMAT, if that's how you think of it, the test writers will always be one step ahead of you. And so to understand absolute value conceptually, you want to think of it as meaning the distance from 0. And so I will make a number line here. Here is 0. If I were to redraw these numbers on a number line, 5, or positive 5, I should say, is 5 away from 0. So that is why the absolute value of 5 is equal to 5. It is also true that negative 5 is 5 away from 0. You cannot have a negative distance. And so that is the reason why the absolute value of negative 5 is also equal to 5. You can infer from this another property of absolute value, which is just the absolute value of anything has to be greater than or equal to 0. And so that is because in this case, x can be equal to 0. And so 0 is 0 away from 0. But in every other case, the absolute value of x will have to be positive. And so even though this is a very basic property of absolute value, oftentimes on the GMAT, you can use it. It is the key to solving a question sometimes. One reason I think people think that absolute value is complicated is because they're always trying to solve for things. And with absolute value, you got to think about what happens when you have positive numbers, what happens when you have negative numbers, which makes it complicated oftentimes to solve absolute value equations or inequalities. But like I said, if you just take a step back sometimes and just think about the basic properties of absolute value, sometimes that is all you need to know. Let's take a look at an example of what I am talking about. Here we have a question that says, if x is not equal to 0, is x greater than 0? So no absolute values in our prompt. It looks like we do have one in our statements, though, in statement 2. So not much information from our prompt. And so we have no choice but to move on to our statements. And so statement 1 just says y is equal to 0. So this should be an easy elimination, an easy insufficient statement, because I've never heard of this y until now. Our prompt was talking about x and was asking us something about x. And then here they gave us a y. So I don't care about y, at least by itself. I should only care about y if it is somehow related to x. So statement 2 now, so now we have an x and a y, and so we got to pay closer attention to this statement. Statement 2 says x over the absolute value of y plus 1 is equal to 3. So this question is a good example of what is very commonly known as a C trap on the GMAT, because if you were to just glance at both statements together, you could very easily say that together they are sufficient to answer the question, because you can easily just plug in statement 1 into the second statement, and that will allow you to solve for x once you have y. But remember, data sufficiency is asking for the minimum information needed to answer a question. So even though from statement 2 by itself, we're probably not going to be able to solve for x or y, it doesn't necessarily mean we can't answer our question, because our question is just asking, is x greater than 0? So what do I know about x? Maybe I should get x in terms of y, get x by itself. And so I can just multiply each side here by the absolute value of y plus 1. That means x is equal to 3 times the absolute value of y plus 1. Now remember, in statement 2 by itself, I don't really know anything about y. Or I should say, they don't tell me anything about y. But one thing I can conclude is that y cannot be equal to negative 1. Because if y were equal to negative 1, we would have a denominator of 0 here, and that cannot be true. So what this is also telling us is the absolute value of y plus 1, since that cannot be equal to 0, it must be positive. And so if we go back to what is this second statement telling us about x, x is equal to 3 times a positive number. And that is really all we know, because all we know about this absolute value expression is it's got to be greater than 0. But 3 times a positive number is always going to give you another positive number. In other words, from this second statement alone, we know x must be greater than 0. And really, we did not need to know much about absolute value to answer that question. We just had to know the basic properties that absolute values always have to be greater than or equal to 0. And in this case, it could not be equal to 0 because we cannot have a denominator of 0. Therefore, the absolute value of y plus 1 had to be positive. That was all that was needed to answer this data sufficiency question. And so, not fall for the C trap, the answer here is B. So now we will start doing the more complicated absolute value questions, ones where you might actually need to solve for your variables or perhaps test numbers to answer your question.